What does it mean to search for company in the universe when we still struggle to understand ourselves? The question has followed humanity for centuries, moving quietly beneath our myths, our science, and our private fears. It lives in the child staring at the night sky from a dark backyard. It lives in the astronomer bent over a screen at 2 a.m., waiting for a pattern to emerge from static. And it lives in the older part of us too, the part that has learned that the deepest questions rarely arrive with easy answers. For a long time, we told this story as if it belonged only to the future. One day we imagined something would appear, a signal, a shadow, a message so unmistakable that doubt itself would fall silent. Until then, we believed we were waiting for proof, waiting for contact, waiting for the universe to speak first. But history has a way of unsettling simple narratives. Across decades and centuries, strange moments have been recorded and then set aside. A burst of sound in the dark, a shape in the sky that should not have been there, a trace left in a forest, a fragment of matter drifting through the solar system with no clear origin and no easy explanation. Each event, on its own, can be folded back into caution, a misreading, an anomaly, a story told too late. Science properly asks us to be careful. Yet there are times when caution begins to resemble avoidance, when our refusal to leap becomes a refusal to look. This is not a story about certainty, it is a story about thresholds, about the thin line between evidence and interpretation, wonder and discipline, memory and fact. And above all, it is a story about human beings standing in the presence of mystery, trying to decide whether the silence around us is truly empty or simply full of voices we have not yet learned how to hear. What if the universe spoke only once, and we were too uncertain to answer? In the summer of 1910, inside an observatory in Ohio, the search for distant intelligence looked almost painfully ordinary. Paper printouts rolled from a machine. Columns of numbers stood in place of stars. The work demanded patience more than drama. Then, in the middle of that routine, one signal rose out of the noise with such clarity that it stopped a scientist in his tracks. It lasted just 72 seconds. The frequency was striking. It sat near the hydrogen line, a part of the radio spectrum long imagined as a natural meeting place for civilizations separated by unimaginable distance. Hydrogen is everywhere. It is the common language of the cosmos, the simplest atom, the quiet foundation of stars. If one mind in the galaxy wanted to be found by another, this was where many believed it might choose to speak. And then the signal was gone. No second transmission followed. Telescopes returned to the same patch of sky again and again. Researchers tested mundane explanations, from interference on Earth to passing objects closer to home. Nothing fully settled the matter. The event remained suspended between possibility and restraint, powerful enough to be remembered, incomplete enough to resist conclusion. What makes such moments linger is not only their mystery, but their shape. A brief emergence, a perfect interval, a pattern that feels less like chaos than intention. Yet science does not grant meaning simply because something feels meaningful. It asks for repetition, verification, the humility to admit when one extraordinary moment is still only one moment. Still, there is something deeply human in the fact that a single burst of radio energy could echo for generations. Perhaps that is because the signal did more than cross space. It touched an old hope in us, the hope that the silence is not absolute, and that somewhere beyond our reach, someone once looked our way. Could something have been watching long before we learned how to look back? At the turn of the 20th century, radio was still a newborn language. Sparks leaped across coils. Inventors listened to static as if it were weather, and the air itself seemed to be filling with invisible possibility. In that strange early age, Nikola Tesla reported receiving signals he could not explain, pulses that seemed too organized to be random and too distant to feel earthly. Many dismissed the claim as imagination outrunning evidence. Yet the idea did not disappear. It settled into the margins of scientific memory and waited. Decades later, other anomalies surfaced. Radio operators described echoes that returned too late, as if their signals had traveled somewhere unexpected before coming home. Then came reports during the early years of the space age of an object in polar orbit at a time when such placement appeared beyond known capability. Piece by piece, these incidents were separated, explained, or absorbed into the background noise of a rapidly modernizing world. A misread instrument here, space debris there, a confusion of rumor, error, and technological growing pains. And yet the image that remains is difficult to shake. Not a dramatic invasion, but a patient observer. Something silent, something choosing altitude and distance over display. A presence that, if it existed at all, preferred the logic of surveillance to the theater of contact. A polar orbit is not poetic. It is practical. It allows a watcher to pass over every latitude, every coast, every city, every hidden place where human life unfolds. That detail matters because it shifts the question from fantasy to perspective. If another intelligence ever noticed Earth, why would it announce itself first? Why not simply study, record, and wait? Perhaps that is what unsettles us most. Not the possibility of being attacked, but the quieter possibility of being observed. To be seen without knowing. To imagine that while humanity was learning to speak into the sky, something above us may already have been listening. What do we do with a mystery that arrives centuries too early for instruments, yet too vividly to dismiss? In the spring of 1561, as dawn spread over the rooftops of Nuremberg, people looked up and saw something that broke the familiar order of the sky. The morning should have belonged to bells, smoke, and the slow beginning of work. Instead, witnesses described shapes moving overhead in strange formations, spheres and crosses, objects like cylinders, forms that seemed to emerge and scatter as if the heavens themselves had become a stage for some incomprehensible event. What matters is not only what they said they saw, but how they tried to preserve it. The scene was documented in a printed broadsheet, an attempt to give public memory a durable form. In an age without photography, this was how a community told the future. This happened, we were here, and we do not know what it means. The language was not modern, and the worldview was still threaded with omens and religion. But beneath that older vocabulary was a recognizable human impulse. People were trying to describe what they had witnessed as honestly as their time allowed. Skeptics have long pointed to atmospheric effects, halos around the sun, distortions of light that can turn the sky into a theater of illusion. That may explain part of it. Perhaps fear and symbolism did the rest. But even then, the event endures because it sits in that uneasy space between misinterpretation and authentic astonishment. It reminds us that mystery did not begin with radar screens or military footage. Long before modern technology, human beings were already encountering moments that stretched language to its limit. There is something humbling in that continuity. The same sky covered them. The same questions rise in us. We like to think uncertainty belongs to the past only because science had not yet matured. But perhaps uncertainty is permanent. Perhaps every age, no matter how advanced, still stands under the heavens with only partial vision, trying to name what passes overhead before it disappears again. What happens when trained witnesses see something they were never prepared to name? In the winter of 1980, the forest near an American airbase in eastern England held the kind of darkness that seems to absorb sound. Pine trunks rose in narrow rows, frost pressed against the ground. Then, beyond the trees, strange lights appeared, descending into the woods with a precision that did not resemble a falling star or a distant aircraft. Security personnel moved toward the disturbance expecting something familiar, a crash, a flare, a misunderstanding that would resolve itself in minutes. Instead, the scene deepened. Military witnesses later described a luminous object among the trees, solid enough to seem present, elusive enough to resist ordinary description. It appeared to move intelligently, slipping between trunks, withdrawing as people approached. On the following night, more personnel returned, this time documenting what they could as events unfolded. Their voices, recorded in real time, carried the tension of professionals trying to stay measured while confronting something that ignored the rules they trusted. What gave the event its strange durability was not only testimony, but traces, impressions in the ground, broken branches, readings above background levels at the reported landing site. None of this proved an extraordinary. Physical evidence is rarely as decisive as we want it to be. It can suggest without concluding. It can point without naming. And yet the significance of the incident lies in the kind of people involved. These were not casual observers telling a story years later. They were military personnel operating in a high-security environment, trained to identify threats and disciplined enough to avoid careless language. Their uncertainty mattered. Perhaps that is why the forest remains in memory, not because it solved anything, but because it revealed how fragile certainty becomes when experience outruns explanation. Even institutions built on control can arrive at the edge of the unknown and find, waiting there, only questions. What if the most intriguing visitor to our solar system was not a world, but a question in motion? In 2017, astronomers noticed an object moving through the solar system on a path unlike anything seen before. It did not belong to the family of planets, moons, and comets born with our sun. It had come from elsewhere, crossing the dark between stars before briefly entering our neighborhood and then continuing on. For a moment, humanity found itself watching not a distant possibility, but an interstellar arrival already on its way out. Its name suggested a scout, a messenger from afar. And almost immediately it refused to behave in ordinary ways. The object was oddly shaped, difficult to classify, and stranger still in motion. As it departed the sun, careful observation suggested a slight acceleration beyond what gravity alone seemed to allow. Comets often do this when heat releases gas from their surfaces, creating a subtle push. But no obvious tail appeared, no cloud of escaping material, no visible sign of the mechanism astronomers expected. It was as if the object carried a secret its observers could sense but not reach. Most scientists lean toward natural explanations, and rightly so. Space is capable of producing forms far more unusual than common sense imagines. A fragment can be stretched, flattened, darkened, and battered over millions of years until it resembles nothing familiar. Yet the unease remained, not because one theory won, but because none felt fully satisfying. A sliver of uncertainty stayed lodged inside the data. What makes that passage so haunting is its timing. We did not detect the object on approach. We saw it only after it had already curved around the sun and begun its retreat. It had entered our cosmic front yard and was nearly gone before we understood it had been there. That fact carries its own quiet lesson. However advanced we believe ourselves to be, our view is still incomplete. The universe may be crossing our path more often than we know, leaving us with only brief glimpses and the humbling realization that discovery sometimes arrives after the moment to fully understand it has already passed. What if the deepest mystery is not in the sky, but in the private terrain of memory? Some experiences do not arrive as spectacle. They come as fragments, a road at night, a gap in time, the uneasy sense that something happened just beyond the edge of recall. For decades, people in different countries and different walks of life have described encounters that sound strangely alike, as if they were remembering chapters from a book none of them had knowingly read. The details vary, but the emotional atmosphere is often the same. Paralysis, dislocation, examination, silence. These accounts are among the most controversial in the entire conversation about non-human intelligence. Psychology offers many careful possibilities. Sleep paralysis can generate a crushing feeling of presence. Trauma can distort memory. Suggestion can shape recollection, especially when interviews are conducted after the fact. Human beings are storytellers by nature, and once a cultural image takes hold, it can spread through film, television, and whispered expectation. And yet the phenomenon resists easy dismissal for one reason: pattern. Researchers who studied these reports found recurring motifs across people who appeared unconnected by geography, age, or background. Many described beings with enlarged eyes and delicate features, communication that seemed to bypass speech, and episodes of missing time that left behind not clarity, but emotional residue. Whatever the cause, these experiences were often felt as profoundly real by those who lived through them. That reality of feeling matters, even when the reality of event remains uncertain. Perhaps the most revealing question is not whether every account is literally true, but why so many human minds return to such similar forms when trying to describe the unknown. Maybe these stories reflect contact. Maybe they reflect the architecture of fear, vulnerability, and bodily helplessness. Or perhaps they reveal how thin the boundary is between outer mystery and inner life. In that sense, the abduction narrative is less a solved case than a mirror. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility. that the search for other intelligences may also be a search through the hidden chambers of our own consciousness, where memory is never as simple as we wish it to be. What if the clearest evidence arrives not as rumor, but as data collected by people trained never to be careless? In 2004, over the cold blue Pacific, a group of Navy personnel encountered something that unsettled the ordinary boundary between observation and disbelief. Radar operators had been tracking unusual objects for days, contacts appearing high above the ocean and then dropping with astonishing speed. These were not vague lights seen from a backyard. They were returns on advanced military systems, watched repeatedly by professionals whose work depended on precision. When fighter aircraft were sent to intercept one of the anomalies, the scene that unfolded felt almost stripped of drama by its own simplicity. A patch of disturbed water below. A white object above it, smooth and compact, with no wings, no visible rotors, no exhaust plume. It moved in ways that seemed less like flight than intention. It responded, it shifted, and then it was gone. What gave the event lasting force was the convergence of perspectives. Pilots saw it. Sensors tracked it. Infrared systems captured an image that later entered public view. In most mysteries, the weakness lies in isolation. One witness, one angle, one imperfect memory. Here, the strength was accumulation. Different instruments and trained observers all brushed against the same unanswered thing. That did not make the conclusion simple. Unknown does not automatically mean extraordinary. Military airspace contains experimental technologies, clutter, error, and the occasional failure of interpretation. But this case endured because, even after years of debate, no explanation fully dissolved it. The object remained where the evidence had first placed it, in the narrow corridor between possibility and proof. Perhaps that is why this encounter marked a turning point. It suggested that the question was no longer confined to folklore or fringe speculation. It had entered official rooms, technical language, institutional concern. And once that happens, the mystery changes shape. It becomes less about belief and more about responsibility. If something is moving through our world in ways we do not understand, then curiosity is no longer a luxury. It becomes a duty of attention. What if the real puzzle is not whether life exists elsewhere, but why a living galaxy has seemed so quiet for so long? In 1961, astronomer Frank Drake wrote down an equation that was less a solution than an invitation to think. It asked how many civilizations in the Milky Way might be capable of communication. And it did so by breaking the unknown into smaller unknowns: stars, planets, life, intelligence, technology, time. The elegance of the equation lies in its honesty. It does not pretend certainty. It simply reminds us that loneliness, too, can be measured against probability. Since then, our picture of the cosmos has changed dramatically. We now know that planets are common. Many stars appear to host worlds. Some orbit in regions where liquid water may exist, where chemistry can linger long enough for complexity to take root. With each discovery, the old assumption that Earth might be singular has grown more difficult to defend. The stage seems vast, fertile, and ancient beyond comprehension. And that last word matters: ancient. The Milky Way is not merely large. It is old enough that if even a small number of civilizations arose millions of years before ours, they might have had time to spread, to observe, to build, to leave traces almost anywhere. On cosmic scales, even slow expansion can eventually cross the entire galaxy. This is the unease hidden inside the arithmetic. If intelligence is possible and if time is abundant, then absence becomes harder to interpret. This tension is often called a paradox, but perhaps it is really a mirror held up to human expectation. We imagine contact as a clear event, a transmission received, a ship arriving, a declaration impossible to ignore. But an older civilization might not behave in ways that satisfy our desire for theater. It might be quiet. It might be patient. It might have passed through Earth's history long before we had language to record it. So the silence may not mean emptiness at all. It may only reveal the limits of our imagination. Perhaps the universe is not refusing to answer. Perhaps we have been listening for a voice, when what surrounds us is something subtler, older, and far more difficult to recognize. What changes when uncertainty moves from the margins of culture into the language of government? For much of modern history, official institutions treated unusual aerial reports with a careful kind of distance. Cases were minimized, archived, or translated into procedural language that kept the deeper implications safely out of reach. Publicly, the tone was often dismissive. Privately, the record appears to have been more complicated. Pilots kept reporting strange encounters. Sensor systems kept collecting anomalies. And over time, the gap between public confidence and internal concern became harder to ignore. Then, in the early 2020s, something shifted. Government assessments acknowledged that military personnel had documented aerial events that remained unresolved and after formal review. That alone mattered, not because it proved an extraordinary origin, but because it changed the cultural temperature of the subject. The conversation no longer belonged only to enthusiasts, skeptics, or late-night speculation. It now involved intelligence agencies, congressional hearings, and the sober vocabulary of national security. Even more striking were claims from officials who said the mystery extended beyond sightings. Some testified that hidden programs existed to study recovered materials of unknown origin, shielded for decades behind layers of secrecy. Such claims remain contested, and contest matters. Serious questions require serious standards. But once statements like these are made under oath before elected representatives, they alter the landscape whether they are ultimately confirmed or not. They force institutions to respond. They force the public to consider how much modern knowledge may be shaped not only by discovery, but by concealment. That possibility touches a very old human nerve. We want to believe that truth, once found, naturally rises to the surface. History teaches otherwise. Knowledge is often filtered through power, access, fear, and timing. So perhaps the most revealing aspect of recent disclosure is not what it settles, but what it exposes about us. We are a species capable of mapping galaxies while hiding information from ourselves. And if evidence of something profound has indeed been handled in fragments, denied in public, discussed in private, then the mystery is no longer only about what may be out there. It is also about how we choose to live with what we know. What if the strongest clue has never been a machine in the sky, but chemistry written into stone and atmosphere? In 1996, a meteorite from Mars stirred a rare kind of public attention. It had fallen to Earth long ago, been recovered from Antarctic ice, and under the microscope seemed to contain patterns that hinted at ancient life, tiny structures, unusual minerals, carbon-rich traces that appeared to whisper of biology. For a moment, the possibility felt close enough to touch. Even the White House responded, as if humanity had suddenly found itself standing near a door or a door it had only imagined. Then came the backlash, which is another way science protects itself. Researchers challenged the interpretation point by point. The shapes might be too small. The chemistry might be produced without life. Contamination from Earth could not be ruled out. Over time, the excitement cooled, and the meteorite came to symbolize the danger of wanting an answer too quickly. Yet what followed was not a clean dismissal. New instruments, sharper methods, and fresh analyses kept returning to the same deeper issue. Some of the chemistry appeared undeniably Martian, and some of the patterns remained difficult to fully explain away. That uncertainty did not stay confined to one rock. As the years passed, other worlds began to offer their own murmurs. Seasonal methane on Mars, strange atmospheric chemistry on Venus, distant exoplanets whose gases suggested processes that, on Earth, are intimately tied to life. None of these findings stands alone as proof. Each remains surrounded by debate, alternative mechanisms, and the discipline of caution. But taken together, they begin to change the emotional weather of the question. Perhaps life is not a singular accident balanced on the edge of impossibility. Perhaps it is something the universe tends to do when conditions allow, a quiet flowering of chemistry into metabolism, complexity, and time. If that is true, then the search for intelligence may rest on a deeper realization. Before minds can emerge, life itself must first become common. And if life is common, then the cosmos may be less like a silent desert than a vast landscape of hidden ecologies, each world carrying its own experiment in becoming alive. What if the traces we call anomalies are not isolated at all, but fragments of one larger pattern we have been too cautious to assemble? By this point in the story, the evidence does not sit in one place. It is scattered across disciplines, centuries, and ways of knowing. A signal in the radio spectrum, a documented vision in an early modern sky, military witnesses standing in a dark forest beside impressions in the earth, pilots tracking objects that seem to outrun the language of engineering, stones from Mars carrying uneasy chemical signatures, an interstellar visitor that passed through our system like a sentence missing its final word. None of these alone can carry the full weight of conclusion. That is the honest position. The danger of this subject has always been the temptation to force coherence where only ambiguity exists. Human beings are gifted pattern makers. We connect dots almost instinctively, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes recklessly. A mature search for truth requires us to live inside that tension, resisting both naive belief and automatic dismissal. And yet there comes a moment when scattered questions begin to lean toward one another. Not proof, not certainty, but a shift in atmosphere. The universe starts to look less empty. Human history begins to feel less sealed off from the wider cosmos. What once seemed like a collection of curiosities becomes, at minimum, evidence of a threshold we are approaching. Our instruments are improving. Our language is changing. Institutions that once laughed are now recording, reviewing, and, however reluctantly, admitting that not everything can be explained by familiar means. Maybe that is how understanding always begins. Not with a revelation that ends debate, but with a slow rearrangement of what counts as possible. If so, then we may be living in a rare kind of era, one in which old stories, disputed sightings, new data, and long-buried questions are starting to speak to one another across time. And perhaps the deepest challenge is not whether the universe contains other intelligences, but whether we are becoming intellectually and emotionally ready to recognize the signs of a reality larger than the one we built for ourselves. What if the hardest barrier to crossing is not distance, but recognition? We often imagine contact as a dramatic symmetry. We send a message and someone answers. We look up and something descends. We ask the universe whether we are alone, and the universe responds in a form we can understand. But that picture may be shaped less by reality than by human longing. It assumes that another intelligence would think in ways parallel to our own, value disclosure, and choose symbols we are capable of receiving without distortion. History suggests a more difficult possibility. Again and again, the most unsettling encounters in this story share one trait. They arrive at the edge of comprehension. A signal appears once and vanishes. A craft, if it is a craft, moves in ways that exceed our working models. A witness describes a sight so strange that later generations debate whether the event was external, psychological, atmospheric, or something in between. Even our best scientific clues are indirect, chemical shadows, and improbable motions rather than clear declarations. It is as though the universe offers hints, but never in the form that would let us remain comfortable. Maybe that is not a failure of evidence. Maybe it is the natural consequence of encountering something genuinely other. An intelligence older than ours, or simply different in kind, may not announce itself through the channels we expect. It may not separate science from mystery, observation from influence, presence from absence. We are accustomed to seeking answers that fit human scales of meaning. Yet the cosmos was not arranged around human convenience. It may be full of realities that do not become visible simply because we are finally ready to notice them. If that is true, then the real threshold before us is inward as much as outward. We may need new instruments, yes, but also new habits of mind, more patience, more humility, a deeper tolerance for ambiguity. Because the next great discovery may not feel like certainty arriving. It may feel like the slow and disorienting realization that the world has always been larger, stranger, and more inhabited than we allowed ourselves to believe. So where does that leave us? After the signals and sightings, the documents and doubts, the fragments of chemistry, and the long, uneasy mathematics of a populated galaxy. Perhaps here, not at the end of an argument, but at the beginning of a more honest relationship with mystery. For generations, we framed the question of other intelligence as a distant prospect, something suspended far beyond our lifetime and safely beyond our responsibility. But the deeper we look, the more that comforting distance begins to collapse. The evidence remains incomplete, yes. It asks for discipline, not surrender. It invites interpretation, not dogma. Yet across science, history, and human testimony, a pattern has emerged that is difficult to ignore. We may not know exactly what has been seen, heard, or measured, but it is becoming harder to say that nothing meaningful has happened at all. And maybe that is the real transformation. Not the arrival of final proof, but the softening of an old certainty, the recognition that being human means living with unanswered questions without turning away from them. We are a young species, brilliant and frightened, capable of splitting the atom, mapping the genome, and still standing speechless beneath the night sky. Our greatness has never been in knowing everything. It has been in continuing to ask. If other minds exist, whether far away or closer than we imagine, their existence does not diminish us. It enlarges the story. It places humanity not at the center of creation, but within a wider community of possibility. And there is dignity in that. To be one voice among many would not make us smaller. It would make the universe more intimate, more alive. So perhaps the final question is not whether we are alone. Perhaps it is whether we are ready to belong to a cosmos that was never ours by itself. Ready to meet the unknown, not with panic or worship, but with maturity, with wonder, with care. And if the universe has already knocked softly more than once, then maybe the future depends on whether we finally learn how to listen.